it is my privilege to introduce our second lecturer for this day. It's Petr Majkan, if I pronounce it correctly. And let me say a couple of words of who he is and what he does. Petr holds a PhD in systematic theology from the University of Aberdeen and also has MTH from the University of Bucharest. After his graduation with the PhD, he worked as a teaching fellow and a postdoctoral researcher in few universities, including the University of Aberdeen, a Catholic University of Leuven in Belgium, and currently he is a postdoctoral research fellow at the Institute of Eastern Christian Studies at Radboud University, Nijmegen, the Netherlands. And interestingly, his current research focuses, as he says himself, on one of the blind spots of Orthodox theology, that is disability. But besides disability, he has done a number of studies on theological anthropology, intellectual disability, Eastern Orthodox spirituality, and other interesting topics. So he works at the intersection of quite a few strands or sub-disciplines within the theology. He's an expert in Eastern Orthodox studies, and his latest publication include one book, Deification and Modern Orthodox Theology, and many different articles. Some of them deal directly with disability. For example, during the last couple of years, he published an article, Learning to Perceive, Grace and the Emotional Conundrum of Disability, in the Modern Theology Journal. And also another article that I would like to mention is the care of persons with intellectual disabilities in Romania, between politics and theology. Right now, also, there is another interesting contribution by Petr is in progress and has to do with childhood and disability. So he's really working hard on this topic, and we'll be happy to hear him speak and tell more about the Eastern Orthodox approach to disability studies. So today, his topic is, as shown on the screen, and it's called beautifully, The Terrible Beauty. And the subtitle reads, The Aesthetics of Disability and Friendship in Eastern Orthodoxy. We are very happy to have Petr with us. So Petr, please now take the floor and give us your presentation. We are looking forward to hearing it.
Thank you very much, Rostic, for this introduction, and thank you very much to the organizers for having me here. I'm going to start with some images that might be a bit that might make some people uneasy, but is precisely this is the point of this whole presentation. The question that I want to discuss today is how can we become friends with someone who makes us experience negative emotions such as fear, disgust, or pity at their very sight? This question is somehow marginal in the Western world, limited mostly to the quarters of disability studies and disability theology, but I think it resonates differently in the actual Ukrainian context, where an important number of soldiers and civilians alike end up with a physical disability, and in some cases, one that makes them stir negative emotions into those who encounter them for the very first time. The usual approach is to say that these negative emotions can be overcome when familial ties are involved, through habituation, or when duty is summoned. If one of my family members return home with an atypical body because of the war, I will get over that, because he or she is flesh of my flesh and bones of my bones. Spending time with someone whom we find disgusting at first might also change our perception. We can discover they have an inner beauty that is so rich and attractive that we end up perceiving the physical differently. Stories like Beauty and the Beast follow the pattern, and people who work with persons with intellectual disability testify similar experiences. Finally, there is duty. One will take care of persons that might elicit negative emotions because this is what they are commanded to do as good Christians, or because the other represents something else on a symbolic level. The soldier who returns with an atypical body from the battlefield has to be cared for because he is a hero, because he defended the country and the freedom of the people. All of these are excellent motivators. There's nothing wrong with family, love, duty, with spending time with people in order to learn how to love. But what I feel that lacks in this enumeration is friendship. People who return with a different body from the front line, or because they have been caught in the crossfire or stepped on a landmine, will need the support of their family, the dutiful care of the Christian community, and the recognition of their status as heroes. But they will also need friends. Friends are those who value and love you not as a family member, nor as a carer or someone from the Veteran Association, but because they are somehow attracted to you. Now let me unpack why I use this definition. When I grew up in post-communist Romania, all that I heard around me was that friends are those people who will help you when your greatest need arises. I have nothing against this definition per se, probably because this is what I still expect from my friends. But when I grew up, I realized how demanding it is to be there for your friends when they are going through a rough period, and wondered, why would people do this? It's hard. One of the reasons that came to mind was that people do it because they expect to receive the same treatment when they are in similar situations. Friendship is basically a transaction. Another reason was that people have principles. They think this is their duty, either because they're Christians or because they want to be perceived as good people by those around them. This approach seems to me to be widespread in the literature on friendship found in disability theology. Influential figures, some of whom have been already quoted, like John Swinton and Hans Reinders, insist that being friends with persons with profound intellectual disability is a Christian duty. It is what Jesus did and what he would want us to do. For John Swinton, friendship is even a radical act of subverting the politics of marginalization for certain groups. Hans Reinders thinks that friendship is a gift from God that has to be given to others. Their approaches made me wonder, once again, if what we are truly talking about is friendship. Since duty and commandment have replaced the pleasure of being with your friend, is it truly friendship, or just another social context in which we have to pretend that we're enjoying something in order to receive the recognition of our peers? To me, the removal of enjoyment from the notion of friendship, particularly in disability theology, is linked with the negative emotions that persons with atypical bodies stir in others. It is very difficult to claim that someone who doesn't fit the standards of aesthetics agreed upon by society produces pleasure in someone who has been exposed her entire life to a certain aesthetic ideal. It is more likely that the person will feel a mix of emotions, ranging from anxiety to pity to disgust. So it becomes much easier to argue that becoming friends with a person with disability is a Christian duty, something that can produce any form of enjoyment. The main difficulty I see with this approach is that friendship becomes just another word for relationship. I'm friends with someone would simply mean that I've met the person and decided to care about him or her because I have to. Friendship is more than this. It is the willingness to spend more time with one person than with the rest of the congregation. Friendship is about opening up to someone because, for some reason, their presence and way of being touches me deeply. And this reason, I argue, is the attraction the other exercises over us, an attraction that originates in the divine beauty surrounding that person. This beauty is different from the harmonious and proportional beauty proposed by society, and in order to have access to it, we need to learn to perceive the world and the other in a way that raises us above negative emotions. I'll make this argument in 3 steps. First, I'll explain that there is a difference between beauty as we understand it and the beauty of God as revealed in the crucifixion. Then I'll explain that our access to the beauty of God is limited by our fallen condition. We live in a world where we perceive the other not as a brother in Christ, but an instrument to be used for the satisfaction of our own desires. To actually perceive that beauty, we need to practice an asceticism of emotions, that is to learn how to control the desire for lust and dominion that is found inside us. Finally, I return to explain that we become friends with someone only when we become able to perceive them in the light of Christ's beauty, so different from ours. The main reason people with atypical bodies stir negative emotions in some people is because their bodies do not correspond to the proportional standard of beauty present in Western art for about 2 millennia. To fit within the standard, our bodies need to have members of the same length, and our physical characteristics have to be neither too big nor too small, nor at too bigger or smaller distance from each other, as you can see in the photo. The eyes should not be too far away from one another nor too close. The mouth should not be placed transversely, but perfectly right. The ears should not be too wide or too elongated. If the standard is transgressed, then the person is considered ugly. The more exaggerated the features, the more uneasiness they inspire. This principle is very well known by the producers of horror movies and political cartoonists. They use exaggerated bodily features to instill fear in their audience, and in the case of the latter, of political cartoonists, to depict the other as inferior and subhuman. As Noel Cowles shows, during the 19th century, you can see in the image, British newspaper often portrayed the Africans and the Irish as being mostly beasts rather than humans. In one case, the one depicted, you can see there, the Irish devilfish was depicted as a literal fusion of a human with a mollusk, a violation of biological categories. While the Africans were often represented as simians, both in caricatures, scientific and popular magazines. But this proportional beauty is not the same with divine beauty, even if at times it seems to be implied by some Orthodox theologians. The main reason this cannot be the case is that there should be a gap between creator and creation, even if some correspondence can be drawn. To understand this point better, we can take the example of the artist and his or her artwork. Any artist will have poured something out of his or her personality into the artwork she created, but it would be strange to say that the artwork itself, no matter how exceptionally good, is identical with the author. A proportional painting can come out of the hands of someone whose body is not at all proportional. A song of war can be composed by a very peaceful person, and so on. Is it true that some of the character of the person is preserved in the artwork? Yes, but there cannot be an identity. And to identify God with his creation would take us very close to pantheism. So now the question becomes, what is the difference between the beauty of God and that of creation? The answer is found in the crucifixion. We have been so habituated with the cross and we have tried so hard to make it aesthetically pleasing that we forgot it is hideous. That we are praying to a convulsed and tortured body that would inspire all the negative emotions described above if we saw it in real life. Yet what makes the crucifixion attractive, I dare say, is the light of the resurrection, the light of the uncreated energies of God. Without this light, the contorted human being hanged on the cross can lead one to atheism and disbelief. In Orthodox theology, this light is usually linked with God's uncreated energies. The doctrine developed by Gregory Palamas and reinterpreted in the 20th century by famous Orthodox theologians claims that we know God from the energies that radiate from his essence, like the rays of sun. These uncreated energies surround and sustain the entire creation and become visible in the saints, who through ascesis become transparent to their light. The story of Seraphim of Sarov, who almost blinded his interlocutor with the dazzling light that surrounded him, remains typological. And I quote, "Then Father Seraphim took me very firmly by the shoulders and said, 'We are now both in God's spirit. Why don't you look at me?' I answered, 'I can, Father, because lightning is streaming from your eyes. Your face has become brighter than the sun, and my eyes are splitting with pain.' Father Seraphim said, 'Don't be afraid. You too have now become as bright as I. You too are now in the fullness of God's Spirit. Otherwise, you could not see me as I am now.'" End quote. It could be easy to read this episode in terms of continuity. The beauty of God enhances the proportional beauty of creation that is already present, or even to think about this episode as the light that fills in the gaps and makes seraphim looks complete, that is proportional, and thus beautiful and attractive. But to me, any of this perspective misses the point. The light of uncreated energies is not beautiful in the same way as the beauty of creation. Its beauty is the revelation of being. It is ontological light. As Pavel Florensky explains, thus, if beauty is precisely about revelation and revelation is light, then I repeat, beauty is light and light is beauty. The absolute light is then the absolutely beautiful love itself in its completeness, which through itself makes every person spiritually beautiful. The feeling that this revelation of beauty stirs is different from that of created beauty. The latter is pleasant, the former is a mix of appeasement and terror. Divine beauty raises us to a level of intensity that is almost unbearable, but which we would not want to stop at all, and that can convince us to sell everything else only to be able to live in this state of exalted joy and terror. It is the feeling the pearl merchant might have had when he had found that one pearl of great price and sold everything he had in order to buy it. It is, I think, the feeling that Rilke described in the verse, "For beauty is nothing but the beginning of terror, which you are barely able to endure." This light of uncreated energies surrounds every human being. What I claim is that asceticism allows us to perceive it and friendship to contemplate it in the other. This doesn't mean we ignore the other for the sake of divine beauty, but that we love the way in which divine beauty uncovers the particularity of the person. Or to put it differently, in friendship, we fall in love with the way in which God loves that person. But this is something we can do only after we have learned how to see the world with ascetical eyes that refuse to perceive the other as an instrument for our own pleasure. The reason why we are unable to perceive the other surrounded by the light of divine beauty is that we live in a fallen world. Orthodox theologians insist that the original sin affected not only the creation itself, the relationship between animals, the apparition of death and natural calamities, but also human inner structure and our very perception of everything that surrounds us, from plants to animals to other humans. Maximus the Confessor, one of the pillars of modern Orthodox thinking, claims that the fall altered the functioning of our inner spiritual structure. For him, humans are constituted of three elements: nous, or the intellect, the logos, or the discursive reason, and the senses. In its primordial state, the nous contemplated God to creation, and reason united the nous with the bodily senses, directing them towards the pleasure of being with God. The fall made the world opaque to human gaze, and this damaged the inner harmony between nous, logos, and the senses. Once the intellect, or the nous, lost the vision of God, reason became fragmented into a multitude of opinions and imaginations, and the senses started finding pleasure in material objects. Thus, it became very hard to perceive the presence of God in creation, including that of his uncreated energies. The main point about this is that this inner disharmony, carried with it ethical connotations. Humans became ignorant, full of self-love, and engaged in a relentless pursuit of bodily pleasure. Since the link between the world and God was no longer visible, humans started looking at the world as an ultimate reality. They put themselves above anything else and approached their neighbors as objects to be possessed. For out of ignorance concerning God, there rises self-love, says St. Maximus, and out of this comes tyranny towards one's kin. Of this there is no doubt. For by the misuse of our own power, reasons, desires, and the insensitive powers, these evils are established. For Maximus, we can regain the perception of God in creation to the practice of contemplation and asceticism. Maximus doesn't deny our fallen condition. He believes that the incarnation or baptism give us the necessary strength to conquer it. The incarnation restores our natural powers, while the Holy Spirit received at baptism, represents the genuine pledge that every Christian can return to a state of perception and discernment, similar to that of John the Baptist when he recognized Jesus as the Son of God. To attain this stage, however, one must go through the process of realigning her intellect with her reason and her senses. Apatheia, or the state where the mind can truly begin to contemplate, is attained only after all bodily and spiritual passions are brought under the dominion of the mind. And this is a quote: "As a little sparrow whose foot is tied tries to fly but is pulled to earth by the cord to which it is bound, so does the mind, which doesn't yet possess detachment, get pulled down and dragged to earth when it flies to the knowledge of heavenly things." The word passions appears very early on in ascetic literature. Already in the 4th century, Evagrius considers passions to be negative emotional states that have to be chased away from spiritual life. In Maximus, the notion is more complex, and passions are not entirely negative. They are movements of the soul or of the body which become bad only when misdirected through irrational love or through senseless hate for something or person. Just an example: eating to sustain oneself is not a passion, except when pleasure is part of it, and only if the latter is without measure or taken as a telos, as a goal in itself, does that passion become morally problematic, like, for example, gluttony. Maximus distinguishes between the passions of the body and those of the soul. The former includes desires originating in natural functions of our bodies, such as hunger or concupiscence. The latter are generated by external objects that produce negative emotional states, such as envy. Envy is stirred by good things that befall to someone by chance and finds delight in the misfortune and even the violence committed against the envied person. I'm not going to get into details here, but each type of passion has specific remedies. The passions of the body can be tamed through prayer, fasting, and vigils. Those of the soul are more problematic, but according to Maximus, they can be conquered by following the commandments and the practices of virtue. To return to the example of envy, those suffering from it strive to transfigure it by learning to rejoice at the good things that fall to their neighbors. Now, I'm sure that everyone has struggled with strong emotions, might feel that the idea of transfiguration is close to a miracle. And Maximus is aware of this, but he is adamant that this transfiguration is the only path to follow in order to return to the contemplation of God. Only when we have managed to master the passions of our body, and the body is no longer emotionally stimulated by the external objects or person, can we truly begin to perceive the presence of God in the world. Now, this state of detachment, this is the point I wanted to make with all this, is important because it allows access to the vision of creation in God. And because ethically, it represents the state where one overcomes self-love in the attempt to imitate God's equal and dispassionate love for all humans. The monastic who reaches this kind of state can contemplate God in creation more accurately and even understand how God's providence works. Yet, this lofty celestial knowledge is inseparable from the love for one's neighbor. Maximus is quite clear that the entire ascetic struggle should lead to equal love for all human beings, regardless of their appearance or our preferences. He says that perfect love doesn't split up the one nature of man on the basis of their various dispositions, but ever looking steadfastly at it, it loves all men equally, those who are zealous as friends, those who are negligent as enemies. Although this discourse seems to erase the distinctiveness of the person in front of us, the opposite is true. This logic is particularly visible in the interpretation of the Transfiguration. When neither Jesus nor the natural elements around him change, they are only perceived differently by the apostle because of the lights that surround them. Moreover, when he speaks about loving everyone equally, Maximus doesn't think that difference should be erased, but that the love each person receives will be proportionate to her needs and particularity. For Maximus, perfect love is an equalizing love that treats any and all according to their peculiar disparity, which for one might be an enslavement to pain, to physical infirmity, but for another an enslavement to pleasure, to the defiance of passions in the seemingly healthiest of bodies. The contemplation of God is then more than piercing the opacity of creation for one's personal gain. It is the path to see the other dispassionately, with a similar love to that of God. Now, to summarize what I said so far, for Maximus and the Orthodox tradition writ large, we experience the world as fallen creatures. That is, we evaluate others through the lens of self-love. It is truly difficult to perceive others without considering the extent to which their presence supports or undermines our self-understanding. Someone who is successful might stir envy, while a person with disability might stir fear and disgust because her presence reminds us of our own limitations and vulnerabilities. To extricate ourselves from this optic, we have to cleanse our perception through asceticism and wait for the gift of grace. It is the grace of God that enables us to perceive the other, surrounded by the light of God. But it is rare for grace to arrive without attending constantly to our own self-centeredness. This comes very close to the mainstream discussion in disability theology. People don't want to be friends with persons with disabilities because they don't see any way in which to instrumentalize them. Not that this didn't happen before. But Thomas Reynolds makes this point quite well. Our worth is ascribed in an economy of exchange, which identifies what resources or goods we have to offer. If we cannot accumulate wealth, we cannot purchase. And if we cannot purchase, we not contribute fuel to the economic engine. We are in effect worthless, apart from servicing the productive sector, specifically the marketplace. The difference between Reynolds and Maximus is that for the latter, this is not a societal, but an anthropological issue. And I like to emphasize that. It is simply because we live in a capitalist world where humans exploit and instrumentalize one another for their pleasure. This has always been the case because we are a fallen creature. In any kind of system we are going to live, this is going to happen in one way or another. Maximus also gets very close to the solution proposed by Swinton and Reinders regarding the integration of persons with disabilities. Although Maximus doesn't speak about persons with disabilities directly, he insists that our engagement with others should be based on the imitation of Christ and not our preference. We should strive to cleanse our perception by obeying the commandment of love, and in this way restore to personhood anyone who might seem not to be assigned any worth by society. What I want to develop further in the last part of this presentation is that this asceticism is just a preliminary stage that opens the door to friendship, to love the other in the light of God's uncreated energies. Or to put this differently, the ascetic effort of clearing one's perception through fasting, prayer, and obeying the commandments allows us to perceive the other clothed in the attractive, terrifying, and yet safe divine beauty. And to make this argument, I'll now turn to Paweł Florensky's Theology of Friendship. Paweł Florensky is probably one of the most important Orthodox theologians of the 20th century. He was a polymath who could write competently about physics, logic, philosophy, theology, mathematics, and electricity. His most important contribution is found in the book The Pillar and the Ground of Truth. The work is particular in that it doesn't take the classical form of a theology treatise, but of 12 letters addressed to an unknown friend. Each letter treats a different topic, from epistemology to Trinity to jealousy to sin, but not in a systematic manner, so that sometimes these topics overlap. The 11th letter is about friendship. Florensky begins by distinguishing friendship from other types of societal relationships based on love, such as love for parents, love for the romantic partner, or love for one's country. Ancient Greek, he explains, employ distinctive words to describe all these types of love. Eros, philia, agapan, storgery. Eros refers to passionate, sensuous, and lustful love that makes oneself surrender to an object. Philia describes an inner inclination towards a person that is born out of closeness and intimacy. Philia is also associated with the feeling of satisfaction when we are with that particular person. Storgery describes the love for one's kind, such as love of parents for children or of citizens for their country. That is a calm and permanent feeling in the depths of the loving one that cannot be destroyed by any evil. Agapan is moralistic love based on rationality. This is the kind of love we are able to justify because it is more about conviction than anything else. Unlike eros or philia, which are instinctive, agapan is deliberative and almost non-involved love for the other. Florensky focuses on agapan and philia because these are the two words that we also find in the New Testament. He insists on the spontaneous and pleasant character of philia in contrast to agape. For him, agape is somehow impersonal, abstract, and the main difference lies in how the other person is perceived. In the case of agape, he argues, the other is approached because he has certain characteristics, as for instance in the case of Swindon and Reinders. They are being poor, they are disabled, marginalized, while philia can be described more as falling in love with the person herself. And now I quote from Florensky. Agapan has in view the property of a person. Philein has in view the person herself. The former gives itself an account of its inclination, calculates and weights, while for the latter, the inclination is revealed spontaneously. Therefore, agapan has a moral tint, while philia doesn't have any moral tint, for philia is spontaneous love, not free by its nature, but while amare is love as the direction of the will determined by the rational mind, the rational mind. Now, Florensky goes even further in this analysis, and he establishes 4 characteristics of philein. He says philein is based on personal contact, from which it springs naturally. We might meet someone on the street, and this will allow us spontaneously to become friends if there is some conversation there. Philein provides a deep insight into the person herself that goes beyond a list of qualities. We do not exactly know why we are friends with some of the people that are around us. We could make a list of qualities, but none of those would suffice. He also says that philia is somehow irrational, in the sense that it cannot be properly explained. And then he also says that philia is neither passionate nor impulsive nor turbulent as the romantic love. It is about intimacy, personal, deeply, and inward. The New Testament, Florensky remarks, uses philia and agape almost interchangeably. Agape is used whenever the commandment to love everyone, including one's neighbors and enemies, is mentioned. Philia is used alternatively with agape in order to describe the friendship between Jesus and Lazarus, or the beloved disciple. Since agape is employed only in regard to commandments, Florensky concludes that it signifies a love that, through a decision of the will, selects for itself its object, thus becoming a self-negating and passive self-surrender for and for the sake of the object. Such sacrificial love on a secular basis is known only as fleeting, feeling and inspiration for another world, not as a termination of life activity. The biblical agape, therefore, has features that are not human and conditional, but divine and absolute. For Florensky, Christianity promotes an agapic view of friendship grounded on the desire to follow God's commandment in a matter that is deliberate and inclusive. By contrast, things philia cannot be realized outside the dyad of friendship. As he sees it, a religious community is supported by a double bond, personal connection, which goes from person to person and is based on the feeling of the members of the society, and the general love for the whole community. In this case, the object of love is not a single person taken by himself, but all of society projected on a person. For the ancient Greeks, these two bonds were eros and storge, romantic love and love for one's kin. Christians replaced them with the more spiritualized agape and philia. The Eucharistic celebration represents the culmination of the agapic love, where everyone in the community partakes in the sacrament of the body and blood of Christ, the source that nourishes all other life activity of the ecclesia, from the everyday torment of the mutual bearing of burdens to bloody martyrdom. Now, the philic side of the church refers to the relationships of friendship, 2 by 2, expressed in the Byzantine ritual of adelphopoiesis, or making brothers. To this now obsolete ritual, Florensky attaches great importance because he considered it to embody the exclusivity of friendship that is different from the general agapic love dominating the church. As he puts it very poignantly, I would say, for a Christian, every man is a neighbor, but far from every man is a friend. An enemy, even a hater and a slanderer, is a neighbor, but even a loving person is not always a friend, for the relations of friendship are profoundly individual and exclusive. For me, this quote shows precisely the distinction between friendship, as proposed by Swinton and Reinders, and that intense feeling of longing, belonging, and safety that the friends provide us with. It is our duty as Christians to love everyone, but it is not our duty to receive everyone in our intimacy, first and foremost, because it's almost impossible to be friends with an illimited number of people. And here I'd like to add a bit of a personal and cultural flavor to my presentation. From my experience, some cultures might use the word friend in a way that would seem quite superficial to someone coming from Central or Eastern Europe. When I grew up in Romania, to say someone is your friend meant that you have known each other for a long time, have spent together, and have exchanged at least some personal information with one another. In other cultures, or for some people, the requirements for friendships are rather low. To have met several times in some social circumstances and exchange contacts. Florensky brings us back to this deep understanding of friendship that for me is characteristics of Central and Eastern Europe. Florensky makes us aware of what I would like to call the two stages of friendship. The first is the ascetical, which I associate with the moment when we decide to get out of our comfort zone and meet the other. This is the stage where we follow the commandment and where we learn to perceive the other, beyond social biases, our desire for power and lust. The second stage is the aesthetic and refers to the moment of grace when we discover the other in the light of the divine beauty that surrounds the person. When we experience this light, we are enraptured, we are enchanted, and all we desire is to get to know that person better because we feel she is the one that touches our soul in a way that is once again terrifyingly beautiful and appeasing. The question then is, what do we do? What do we appreciate in the person whom we call a friend? Are we actually attracted by her or the light of God's beauty? This question is far more pressing when I think of persons with atypical bodies. Do we love them for who they are, or are we trying to wash their disabilities and the aesthetic nervousness that comes with it? To all this question, I would answer in the negative. What we are enjoying is that person with all her particular features being transformed by the touch of divine light. Let's take an example. When we look at some object in the translucid light of the summer morning, we are not ignoring the object or its properties. We are perceiving it in a different way that elevates it into another dimension. It provides it with a different significance and depth. This doesn't mean the object becomes beautiful according to worldly standards, but that it becomes revelatory. The same happens with those whom we become friends with. They reveal God to us in a very unique and personal way. One might wonder why we do not become friends with everyone in the church, since all of them are surrounded by this divine light. Couldn't happen that if we practice asceticism and interact with people, we are going to end up seeing them all in the same light and then want to befriend them all? This could be indeed the case. But I think that this doesn't happen as often because of our own specific traits and roles in the church. To use the Pauline analogy of the body of Christ, we are all part of the same body, and we all have different functions. One will be a muscle, another a joint. So when we are befriending someone, this person is going to be different from us. The muscle might want to be friends with the joint, let's say. The beauty of God will illuminate everyone, but there will also be a personal, irrational desire to join those who are not similar to us, and yet not so dissimilar. It is not all about the light of divine beauty, but also about one's place in the body of Christ and inner disposition. So what does this mean for persons with atypical bodies and disabilities that make us feel uncomfortable? First of all, I think it means that we should seek to interact with them, establish the premises of friendship. Then it means that we should learn how to perceive them, not as instruments for the fulfillment of our desire for dominion, lust, or social capital, but as full human beings. From this point, with our gaze naked of passions, we can begin to hope that through a gift of grace, we might perceive the other in the brilliant light of divine beauty. This should allow us to connect with the other in an intimate way that would help us strengthen the body of Christ. And now I'm reaching the conclusions. So, to summarize, what I wanted to do in this presentation was to insist on taking friendship seriously. Friendship is not just another name for relationship. It is a bond that is difficult to forge, but is very rewarding once established. It is rewarding precisely because it is only in friendship that we can discover the other's existence in the light of God. To make this argument, I began by distinguishing between the earthly and the divine beauty. Earthly beauty is proportional and harmonious, while divine beauty transcends these categories. It is the light of the revelation that attracts and terrorizes us at the same time. Someone with an atypical body might not fit into these categories of earthly beauty, but could be surrounded by divine beauty. In our fallen state, it is difficult to perceive this divine beauty because we value more than anything else our own pleasure, which we associate with the other type of beauty, the proportional. For this reason, we can experience negative emotions when we encounter persons with disabilities and atypical bodies. Only ascetical practice, where we learn how to control our desires, can enable us to perceive the other differently. And finally, using the work of Pavel Florensky, I differentiated between agape and philia, between the love for the other, imposed by Christian ethics, and the irrational love for the other that springs from the fascination with her form in the light of divine beauty. This revelation of the other is something rare and precious, and something worth fighting for. Of course, I'm aware that the understanding of friendship that I'm proposing might sound like it would leave some people behind. But in my view, this is not the case. What I argue for is that we continue with the agapic type of love for the others, regardless of their characteristics, because without it, philia cannot exist. Without interaction, there is no chance of perceiving the other differently. What we need, however, is to learn to cleanse our gaze from passions and to wait for the wonderful moment when the grace of God will unveil the person in front of us in the light of his uncreated energies, beyond the proportional categories of our earthly aesthetics. Thank you very much.